Greetings and welcome back to the lesson. We will proceed with the topic financing decision. In today's session, we're going to study the subtopic evaluation of financing options. At a later time, we will study the techniques that can be used in capital budgeting, but at the moment, we will study the factors that need to be considered when recommending a financing method. Evaluation of financing options. So candidates, the objective of today's lesson is that by the end of this lesson, you should be able to discuss the factors that should be considered when recommending a financing method. What are some of the factors that the finance manager should take into account when recommending a financing method? What are the factors? The first obvious factor is, let me put down the preamble, factors to be considered. Factors to be considered when recommending a financing method. The first factor is that one of cost. Cost. When recommending a financing method, the finance manager ought to consider the cost, because you know that different types of or sources of finance come with a cost. If a company is obtain debt, then there is a cost that will be incurred. If a company is to obtain, say, equity capital, then there is a cost attached to equity capital. So when recommending a financing method, it's important to consider the cost. And the cost that is favorable, the cost that is affordable, should be the one that the finance manager should consider. We all know generally that debt finance is cheaper than equity finance. And so if the company has the capacity to take more debt, then that could be a cost advantage. So if obtaining debt finance is cheaper than obtaining equity capital, then it's important, or the finance manager can go for debt equity. So cost is a factor that ought to be considered when recommending a financing option. The second factor is cash flows. Cash flows. Now, I just mentioned that generally debt finance could be cheaper than equity finance. And while debt finance is cheaper than equity finance, it places on the company the obligation to pay out cash flows in form of interest. If a company is to obtain debt, say a bank loan, then there will be an obligation for the company to service the loan through payment of interest on periodic basis. And failure to pay interest, failure to do what? To pay interest can result in an action that can lead to the winding up of a company. And therefore, consideration should be given to the ability of the company to generate cash. And if the company is currently, say, generating cash, then it could be able to pay interest, and debt finance could be a good choice. But if the company is currently using cash for meeting maybe the short-term obligations, then it's not advisable to consider debt finance. All right? The company could be generating cash, yes, but that cash could be needed to pay for the day-to-day expenses. So the company should not go for the debt finance because of the unavailability of cash to pay interest on periodic basis. The third factor to consider is risk. Risk. Now, candidates, the directors of a company must control what we call the total risk of the company, and they should ensure that they keep it at a level where the shareholders and other stakeholders are comfortable or content. The total risk, we know, candidates, is made up of the financial risk and the business risk. Total risk is equal to finance risk plus business risk. And therefore, if it is clear, if it is what? If it is clear that the business risk is going to rise, for example, because the company is diversifying into riskier areas, so because the operating gearing is increasing, then the company may seek to reduce its finance risk, its financial risk. If a company is considering investing in risky projects, that could increase what we call the business risk. All right. Now, if business risk is likely to increase, then the company should ensure that it lowers its financial risk. I've given an example of a scenario that can lead to increase in business risks. That is, if a company is investing in new areas that it has not operated before, then there is risk that the company may not succeed. There is that risk of failure. If a company is venturing in riskier projects, then that could increase the business risk. And if the business risk is increasing, then the company should seek to reduce financial risk. Financial risk may be caused by, say, obtaining debt finance, which we've just mentioned here, the cost. All right, financial risk, it would be the risk that can result as a consequence or an impact of increasing the gearing level. Increasing what? The gearing level. So when evaluating financing decisions, risk is a factor that ought to be considered. The fourth factor, number 4, security and covenants. Security and covenants. Security and covenants is another factor to consider. Now, for example, candidates, if debt is to be raised, security or collateral may be required. And from the data given, it should be possible to establish whether a suitable security may be available. So if a company is to seek debt, in most of the cases, the providers of debt may require the company to have to furnish it with the security or collateral, like the fixed assets, non-current assets, and such like. So a company that does not have access to assets, then that company may not qualify to obtain debt finance. So you can see how security is a factor that ought to be considered. We also have covenants or agreements. Covenants such as those that impose an obligation on the company to maintain a certain liquidity level may be required by debt providers, and directors must consider if they will be willing to live with the covenants or agreements prior to taking the debt. So the providers of debt may require a company to maintain a certain level of liquidity, and that may be contained in an agreement which a company may be required to sign. So the company ought to evaluate whether it will be able to maintain a certain level of liquidity. So when obtaining, when evaluating financing options, it's important to consider the possible covenants. Another obvious factor is availability of finance. Availability. Now, candidates, the likely availability of finance must also be considered when recommending a suitable financing option or a suitable financing source. For example, a small or a medium-sized company requires more equity. All right? It requires what? More equity. So it's important to suggest potential sources such as the venture capitalists or the business angels and so on. Company that is young, that is growing, may require equity. So if it requires equity, then is that equity available? And if it's available, where will it be obtained? What will be the source of equity? So availability of a source of capital is also a factor to consider when recommending a financing option. Availability of capital. Does the company have access to venture capitalists? Does it have access to business angels? And furthermore, if the recent or the forecast financial performance of a company is poor, then investors are likely to be worried about investing their finances in such a company. Availability of source of finance. Number 6, the sixth factor to be considered is the maturity. Maturity. What do I mean by maturity? Candidates, the basic rule is that the term of finance should match the term of the need, what we call the matching principle. The matching principle. Now, if, say, a loan is required to finance the activities of a company for, say, 3 years, all right, 3 years, then the maturity of this loan should be at least 3 years. This loan should mature in 3 years. That is the basic rule. And therefore, a short-term project should be financed with the short-term source of finance. If it is a short-term project that the company is seeking to finance, then the maturity period of that source of finance should be at least 3 years, should match. All right? The period of the project should be matched with the maturity of the source of finance. If the project is short-term, but other short-term opportunities are expected to arise in future, then it's important to use the long-term source of finance. It could be 3 years, but there are other needs that ought to be met in 3 years. So that in such a case, then the period should not be much. It's supposed to be at least more than 3 years, say 5 years, because of the competing need for capital. Number 7, control. Control is another important factor that financial managers consider when evaluating financing decisions. For example, if debt is raised, then there will be no change in control if debt is raised. But if equity is raised, control may change. By control here, I'm referring to ownership. Companies are controlled by what we call ownership. A shareholder that holds more equity, then we can say that shareholder has a larger control of the company. So where we have said 10 shareholders and the company seeks to obtain equity finance, then that means that more shareholders will be brought on board. If 30 shareholders are brought on board, then you can see these 10 initial original shareholders will lose their control. All right? That means that the company will now be controlled by 40 shareholders. In such a case, we say that control has been diluted. So control or dilution of control is a factor to consider when evaluating financing decisions. Control. We can discuss many other factors. These are 7 factors. We have other factors like costs and ease of issue. Ease of issue. Ease of issue. Ease of issue. How easy is it to issue shares, for example? We know that generally debt finance is cheaper and easier to raise than equity. You are talking about of ease. How easy is it to raise equity? How easy is it to raise debt? And therefore, if a company is in urgent need of finances, then it may be easier to go for debt finance because it is easier to raise a capital through debt. So the company will often raise debt rather than equity because it is easier and it may be less costly. And raising equity, we know, is often difficult. It may be time consuming. It may also be costly. So candidates, these are 8 factors to consider when recommending a financing method. And that effectively brings the lesson to an end. I'll give you one question. Explain 7 factors to be considered when recommending a financing method. That will be your assignment. Thank you. I hope to meet you in our next session. God bless you. Goodbye.